Perfect. So I'm Jos Bezemer. I'm a senior interaction designer at In10, and Door, it's a cultural label. I'll hope to stick within 15 minutes or something. Probably won't, but Peter will probably correct me if I will.
I'll try to.
Great. For this project, I'll highlight more the end part. So the part that Michiel and Lizzie told you is basically about how it should work. And we have worked on the presentation. So how are we gonna present this entire database basically and all these connections in a visual way. Didn't do it alone, of course, worked with Marilyn and Ferdi. We did the visual design, Gilles did the front end, and Jacco had his work on concept and strategy. So our goal was to make a user-friendly platform. As you've seen in the screenshots of the old website, wasn't quite user-friendly yet. It worked, but that was about it. We created a tagline that we used to basically make our story with. The tagline is a bit unfortunate, seeing the current events in Ukraine. We called it the Oorlog dichtbij, or the war from up close. 2 years ago, it was very far away. These days, it's a bit closer, but this was the frame of reference that we used to work on this. The things that our parents or grandparents experienced in the war are being forgotten, are not always being passed down. And it's important for us to keep this part of human history alive and keep these stories being told. So the project started in February of 2020. So as you might have guessed, that every meeting after the kickoff has been an online meeting. And I think I've seen Lizzie and Michiel twice or 3 times in person, if not on a Zoom call or a Hangouts call. The first thing that Michiel said during this first kickoff presentation was something like this. It wasn't exactly this. He exactly said, everything is data. And that really stuck with me, because it really was something like, sure, Michiel, everything is data, whatever you want, we'll see about it. And really it clicked much later what he actually meant by this. At In10, we're now just calling this Spink Magic. It really confused a lot to us, because how are we going to present this data? If everything is data, how are we going to present this to a non-professional? You've seen the screenshots of the previous websites. The data was all there, but the connections were there, but we couldn't present them yet. So how are we going to make them relatable? How are we going to tell this story? Main thing is, and you'll hear me saying this a lot in the coming 10 minutes, is by providing context. So our aim was to use the context of the user to bring the learnings and the experience of the Second World War to life. Our initial idea focused on places, so where you live, personal interests. I have no idea how we're going to do that. We skipped over that part rather quickly. Combined with milestones of the war, so bringing the context of the war to whatever you're doing right now. So instead of using objects to tell a story, kind of like what Michiel said, we turned it around and we started telling a story supported by these objects. Really sounds the same, but the difference is that it's not actually about the objects at all. The objects are a secondary character in this story. It's really about the events that take place, or the people or the locations, and the objects tell the story about it. Objects by themselves don't really say anything. So as a proper agency that we are, we did it right the first time. If I start looking at the old designs for the search overview page, we used stuff like this. I think this was in a pitch, or maybe, yeah, I think a pitch version of it. We were all about visual presentation, of course. Everything was nice to look at, extremely unrealistic as well. I don't even think we managed to build this first part of the website. So we started iterating on it. We started making new versions, really trial and error, trying to make other stuff. So I think about 4 or 5 versions later, we ended up with something like this. The one on the right is a screenshot that I took yesterday of the website. We really started to grasp how this knowledge graph of Spink started to work and how it could give us data. We started working with clusters instead of individual sources. So again, combining sources or objects together, like in pictures or people or videos, events, or written articles by Tessa and Janneke. Those would really give more context to the search query that you were doing. If you're looking for a person, you could find other people that were related to the same search query. If you were looking for an event, for example, then you could find this one person, but you could find people who are related to it as well. All these clusters also have a prioritization. So if there are more people than there are videos, then people might get higher up, but videos are worth more than pictures, for instance. So videos would get higher than pictures are. All these kinds of business rules really helped giving this a good overview. As you see on the right, we started using color as well to give identity to some of the parts. So everything that's a organization, a theme, or a location are green. Everything that's about a person, that'll be blue. Those are colors that we're using throughout the website, so it'll be consistent. So things that look alike will act alike. And the learnings that we got from this part really helped in our next phase, because that's what I'm going to mainly show you, which is Oorlogslevens. So the lives of people, the people pages. I called it Life During Wartime because I needed an English title for you, all the English speaking people. So to get to those profile pages, to get to those timelines of people, we had a design, but to get to that design, we had to start somewhere. And we started with a Miro board. So as everybody has done in the past 2 years, or every design agency at least, we started in Miro or Mural, whatever you're using. And we used this for a week. We got together, the three of us, so Spink, Oorlogsbronnen, and Inten Door. And we started to see and experiment and make some sketches and mock-ups and see what we were trying to tell. We were trying out stuff. How would we want to present some things? And Janneke and Lizzie started, what kind of stories do we want to tell? Unfortunately, there was already a lot of data that we could work with, because there was already Oorlogslevens.nl, a previous website that used pages like this, which would highlight events of a person based on a timeline. But this is exactly the point that I was making before. These are events standalone on a timeline of a person. They don't give any context to whatever happened to this person or whatever they were experiencing during their lifetime. So we took this as a starting point and we started elaborating on it. We started defining stuff. So we started with personal events and what Lizzie later called meso events, bigger events. I really had to Google those terms. And we started doing stuff like this in the Miro session in the week that we worked together. We started defining what a person is. So what does a person consist of? It's events, it's global events, it's meso events, and whatever is in an event. So an event is one of these 28 items. They always have a date, a name, a location, for instance. We figured out later that's not always true. We have to make fallbacks for everything. But we really wanted to make these rules and regulations for whatever is going to happen over here. Lizzie can tell you how much I like to try and define things. I keep writing up stuff and writing business rules for stuff. Turned out that was the goal to making this all work, because it's impossible to decide what the design is going to be for about 300,000 pages with varying data. People with huge timelines with every event specified, somebody like Anne Frank, which we know everything of, but also it could be that you find your brother's ex-girlfriend's neighbor's grandfather in here who doesn't even have a name. So we're gonna have to make rules and regulations for all these situations that might happen. We've found out that personal events consist of 5 main types. You're born, which is different. You might have died, but there are like 5 different ways of people dying, and we don't always know if people died, and some people are still alive. So we have born, we have things with a location and a date, a location and multiple dates, a from to location and a date, and a from to location and multiple dates. So based on these, I tried making a framework with this. So I started
10 minutes, Jos.
10 or 5?
Yeah, 10.
Okay, that's perfect. So with these things, I try to grasp whatever we're working with. So these are screenshots of my initial design. I didn't really design pages. I started designing components, started writing down components. What do they consist of? What are the rules of it? These personal components, all 28 variations of it, was really a lot of work to write them all down. But in the end, this really made sure that we had these separate components which could all work individually. So they could work if you would put number 5 ahead of number 2, but also number 1, 2, 3 in a row, or number 3 and then number 8, for instance. They would all have to work in whatever order they could exist. And to give some context to these personal events, because these are still just events without any context of what the world was like at that point, we defined categories for people. These were the initial categories that we had, and for each category of a person, we had several events. We started out with multiple events. I think we ended up with only 2 events per person. So these are the meso events, the bigger events in a person's life. And Lizzie and Janneke, and I think Tessa as well, made all kinds of spreadsheets with all kinds of lists of events. And this is really the part where Lizzie was talking about. We really don't know our history that well. They know it freakishly well. They have a scary amount of already knowledge about the war, and they can really make these things really easily. But that made sure that whatever we were designing with was always going to be real information. It was going to be a test from Spink. It was going to be information from the Oorlogsbronnen team, and we were going to see how we could design this. The meso events were actually quite easy to grasp because they are so curated. The last thing that we did, for me, the most important bit of the entire week that we worked together, was defining 7 search strategies. These are the search strategies of Spink, and these could tell if a personal event, for instance, was part of a bigger event, but also who was part of this bigger event, or who else was part of this personal event. So if somebody was present at a razzia or was apprehended at some point, we could see who are these people that got arrested as well, where are they now, and we can look at their pages as well. Really linking this data made sure that we could design whatever we were thinking of, because the search strategies proved that whatever we were thinking of was actually possible. So as I said, we started designing components. Instead of pages, we took all these generated components separately and started designing them in a way that they would make sense in whatever order they were used. So all personal events are also designed with fallbacks from rich to basic, so we could guarantee a personal event would always happen. I'll show you in the final design over here. This is the timeline of Leendert Quist. I don't know who he is. I didn't really pay attention, but Lizzie explained it to me once. But he has a really rich way, a really rich life. I can really show you some things on this. So as you can see, we started with this event of him being born. As you can see, we have a lot of information. The images on the left are images of the place he was born. So we take some sources from his place of birth. If it's a location that we can find, we can use the location. If it's not a location, then we're going to use a province where he's born. So it might be that you're looking at a smaller place and you actually get pictures of Amsterdam, for example, while he's not born in Amsterdam. But that's the thing with all these generated pages, all this generated content. We're using a map tool to highlight locations on the background if there's a location. This gives some context as well, showing you about, no, this is Amsterdam, this is where he was, also dresses it up visually nicely. These are the meso events. So these are the bigger events in somebody's life. I think this one was because he was a civilian, and we're basing this also on wherever he lived at that point. So we know where he lived in Amsterdam. We actually know the address apparently, and we also know his age. So we're using a little plus over here to highlight some information about this meso event. You can click on it, it'll give us a little side panel and you'll get a bit of information about this event. And you can also see what his age was and where he was. All this gives more context about his age and his life at the point of this event. So when he was 23, the Germans start to invade North Holland.
And now it's 15 minutes, Jos.
Okay, I'll go really quickly.
Yeah, that's okay. No.
We got other events like these, which by themselves give a lot of information, but the events on the site give a bit more information. So we got the daily life during German occupation with a video, which was attached to it, but also some events that highlight how occupation during German occupation was, how life during German occupation was. For instance, if you have somebody who was in the military, you will have the militarization over here and some events about that. We've got many events on somebody's page. As you can see, he has quite a lot of content, but I wanted to highlight this one specifically because it's transportation. It's a bit different than all the other ones because the transportation gives you a lot of data as well. As you can see, we know he was on a certain transport from Kamp Amersfoort to Neuengamme, and we actually know the 1,407 other people who were on this transport as well, which is really amazing and really interesting to look at because we already seen screenshots of this, but you can actually see what the categories were and who those people were. So this was a transport of mainly civilians. Some of them were in the resistance and only 21 were Jewish that we know of. There's also always an asterisk that we know of. And we can actually see who these exact persons were. So we know those 1,407 people. It's not just a number that we know. We actually know every person that was on this transport. And this is really an incredible way of showing this data, because you can figure out if you're on this transport or if your grandfather was maybe on this transport, for instance, you can see what the other people were that were on this transport as well. And setting all these data and all these linked objects over here really made sure that we could do this on other places as well. So as Michiel showed you, we got location pages as well where we can do stuff like this. And we also have provinces like Limburg, which went live a couple of weeks ago, where we can use this information as well, because we set those links in those persons in a way that it can be used anywhere on the website, really. So these were my last two slides. Got some learnings design-wise, things that I really noticed, and I want to highlight a bit on. Go from unknown unknowns to known unknowns. There are still a lot of unknowns, but we at least know what those unknowns are for the biggest part. Try to define these, try to design around them, try to define the states, the possibilities, and to document these. It's really difficult to start on a project and realize why you've done something a week later if you haven't documented any of it. It's quite complex like that. It's impossible to control. Let it go. There are 12 million plus sources. There are 300,000 people. Not everything will be designed as you want it to be, Marilyn. But it can happen that stuff looks a bit weird sometimes. But accept it. You're designing data-driven. Get to know the technology. By the time that we really understood how a knowledge graph and how linked open data works, it really started to hit for us how we're going to design around this. Lots of trial and error, experiment. Agile is really the only way to go with this. Don't try and decide whatever you're going to work with and whatever you're going to end up with, especially. I remember multiple days where we thought in the morning a page was going to look as we wanted. And at the end of the day, we designed another page, which was even better because we figured out how the data works. And sometimes because of that, leave the first design to the developer. Just let them experiment, try and see what they can come up with, whatever links or things they can find out, what can the data do, and try to design around that. That's it for me.
All right, thanks, Jos. So we are at 5:01. Wow, that's perfect. We will take one question for you in the plenary thing, and then we will open the rooms. So I saw a question from, let me see, from Andre. What are your motivations to present heritage objects in a story? It's a question to you all, but now it's aimed at you, Jos.
Yeah. So as a story, I'm going to interpret it as the visual way, the more storytelling way that we did. So as I started out in my presentation, the information like this is really difficult to grasp if you're presenting it as data or as information on itself. People are used to having things in a more visual way, more storytelling way to highlight these kinds of this kind of information. So the platform really went to a sort of B2B construction to a B2C construction. So people with general interest about the war, about history, had to be able to read into these things and experience a lot of things. So it really was a first step into falling down that rabbit hole and experiencing more and learning more. So that's why we worked on this story format.
Yeah, all right. Thanks, Jos. Okay, that ends the presentation part of the meetup. But now we want to enable you to, pose some additional questions to the different presenters. And also maybe to meet up around other topics, I don't know. So we created a couple of rooms. So for each of the presenters, there's a room, and there are a couple of additional